It was a Tuesday night in the winter of 1952, and the temperature in Harlem had dropped to 19 degrees. That detail matters, because on a night that cold, men don't stand outside unless they have to. They don't linger on corners, they don't walk slowly, and they certainly don't leave their warm apartments without a very specific reason. Which is why, when a black sedan with jersey plates pulled up outside a building on 116th Street at 11:47 p.m., the three men who climbed out of it into that frozen air weren't doing so for pleasure. They were doing so because they had been summoned. And the man who summoned them had a name that meant something very different in that neighborhood than it did to the police officers who occasionally wrote it down in their notebooks. To the detectives in the 28th Precinct, the name was a case file, a string of charges that never quite stuck, a photograph stapled to a manila folder, a problem they had been managing rather than solving for nearly a decade. To the numbers runners, the poker game hosts, the bail bondsmen, the grocery store owners on Lenox Avenue, and the women who kept the books in the back rooms of Harlem's underground economy. To all of them, the name meant something closer to architecture, something that held the entire structure up. The name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but everyone called him Bumpy. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about the world this story takes place in, because without that understanding, what happens next won't land with the full weight it deserves. Harlem in the early 1950s was not a simple place. It was not the sanitized version you've seen in certain films. It was a borough within a borough, a city inside a city, where the formal economy and the underground economy were so tightly interwoven that separating them would have collapsed both. Numbers running alone. That's the street lottery, the informal gambling network that operated out of barbershops and candy stores and apartment hallways, generated an estimated $2 to $3 million a year in Harlem by conservative estimates. Some historians put that figure significantly higher. The point is, the money was real. The stakes were real. And the men who controlled that flow of money wielded a kind of power that no elected official, no precinct captain, and no federal agent fully understood from the outside looking in. Bumpy Johnson controlled a significant portion of that world. He had built it methodically, painfully, across decades that included federal prison time, near-death experiences, betrayals, and alliances that shifted like weather. By 1952, he wasn't simply a crime figure. He was, in the truest sense of the word, an institution. The kind of man whom other dangerous men treated with a specific kind of deference. Not because they were weak, but because they were smart enough to recognize what he represented. So when a man named Tony Delucci, a mid-level associate connected to certain Italian-American crime interests operating out of the Bronx and Lower Manhattan, sat across a table from Bumpy Johnson at a private meeting in early 1952 and decided, for reasons that historians and street historians alike have never fully explained, to mock him openly in front of witnesses. The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows a joke that didn't land. Not social awkwardness. A different kind of quiet entirely. The kind that enters a room the way a cold draft enters through a cracked window. Slow, invisible, and impossible to ignore once you feel it. Bumpy Johnson, by all accounts, did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He did not make a threat. What he did, according to the people who were in that room, and later spoke about it in careful, indirect terms, was look at Delucci with an expression that one witness later described as the face of a man who had already decided something, and was simply waiting for the meeting to finish. Within 72 hours of that meeting, 3 of Delucci's most trusted street-level men had vanished from their usual posts. Within a week, 2 more had quietly relocated, and Tony Delucci himself, a man who, by all accounts, had never shown fear to anyone in his adult life, began making calls. Quiet calls. Apologetic calls. But by then, the message had already been delivered. The question, the one that still echoes through accounts of this period, is how. How did Bumpy Johnson, without firing a single shot, without issuing a single documented threat, dismantle the confidence of a man who had every structural reason to feel untouchable? That answer requires us to go back, much further back, to a Harlem that most people alive today never knew, and to a young man from Charleston, South Carolina, who arrived in it with nothing except an unusual mind, an unusual temperament, and an absolute refusal to be diminished by anyone. Stay with me. To understand Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, you have to understand the Harlem he inherited and the Harlem he helped shape. He was born on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. Halloween. Some people have made much of that detail over the years, lending it a theatrical quality. But the more important detail is the one that followed him north. He was born into a family with some social standing in the black community of Charleston, which gave him a sense of dignity early, and then life systematically tested that dignity at every turn. He arrived in New York in his early teens, moving in with a sister in Harlem. This was during the first wave of the Great Migration, the enormous, transformative movement of black Americans from the rural South to the urban North that would reshape American culture, politics, music, and crime from the 1910s to the 1970s. Between 1910 and 1930 alone, over 1.6 million black Americans relocated to northern cities. Harlem, in particular, became the gravitational center of black American urban life. But the promise of Harlem came with a brutal asterisk. While the Harlem Renaissance was producing Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington and Marcus Garvey and a cultural explosion that would echo for a century, the economic reality for most black residents was constriction at every turn. Redlining practices locked black families out of home ownership in most of the city. Formal employment opportunities were heavily restricted. Banks did not extend credit to black businesses at equitable rates. Police operated in Harlem with a different standard than they applied in white neighborhoods, sometimes looking the other way for a fee, sometimes cracking down with disproportionate force, rarely with any consistent logic that served the community itself. In that environment, the underground economy wasn't simply crime. For a significant portion of the community, it was survival infrastructure. The numbers game, sometimes called policy, provided not just gambling income, but employment for hundreds of runners, writers, and controllers. It funded churches. It supported bail funds. It kept certain blocks stable when formal institutions had abandoned them entirely. Into this world came young Ellsworth Johnson, who had a gift for mathematics, a taste for literature. He would carry books with him his entire life and was known to quote poetry during negotiations, and a capacity for violence that he deployed with precision rather than enthusiasm. His early years in Harlem brought him into contact with the dominant power of the era, Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, the Martinique-born numbers queen who had built an empire through the 1920s and who ran her operation with a ferocity and organizational sophistication that made her one of the most powerful figures in New York's underground, of any background. St. Clair became a mentor of sorts to the young Johnson, and the lessons he absorbed from her were not only tactical. They were philosophical. St. Clair believed that black enterprise in Harlem needed to be protected from the same forces that oppressed black Americans everywhere else, including, crucially, the encroachment of organized crime figures from outside the community who wanted to take control of the numbers racket by force. And in the 1930s, that threat materialized in a very specific form. Dutch Schultz. Arthur Flegenheimer, Dutch Schultz, was one of the most feared organized crime figures in New York in the early 1930s. He controlled bootlegging operations, ran a violent enforcement apparatus, and by 1931 had decided that the Harlem numbers racket was too lucrative to leave in the hands of its existing operators. He began a systematic campaign of intimidation and violence to take control of the policy banks, forcing out or absorbing the independent operators who had built the game. Bumpy Johnson was among the handful of men who resisted. This was not a minor decision. Schultz's organization at this point had killed multiple people who had stood in his way, and his reach into law enforcement and the courts was significant. Resisting Schultz meant accepting the very real possibility of death, arrest on manufactured charges, or the destruction of everything Johnson had built. But Johnson resisted anyway, and his resistance became the foundational legend on which everything that followed was built. The details of that conflict, the specific encounters, the back-channel negotiations, the moments of violence and the moments of strategy, are documented in fragments across court records, newspaper archives, and oral histories collected by researchers in subsequent decades. What's confirmed is that Johnson survived the Schultz era, and that his survival was not passive. It was active, it was calculated, and it cost him. He served time in federal prison. He came back. He rebuilt. He served more time. He came back again. Each cycle of incarceration and return added to the mythology, but more importantly, it added to the network. Prison, for a man like Bumpy Johnson, was not simply punishment. It was a room full of people who would owe him favors, respect his authority, and extend his reach when they returned to the street. By the late 1940s, Bumpy Johnson had survived Dutch Schultz, survived multiple federal prosecutions, survived the chaos of the war years and the economic disruptions that followed them, and emerged as the preeminent power figure in Harlem's underground economy. Which brings us to the specific landscape of 1952, and to the question of why a man named Tony Delucci thought it was safe, or perhaps necessary, to disrespect him in a room full of witnesses. Tony Delucci was not a nobody. This is important to establish, because the story loses its weight if we reduce him to a simple fool who didn't understand who he was dealing with. The historical record, such as it exists for a mid-level organized crime associate whose name appears in federal surveillance documents and in accounts from people who operated in that world, suggests a more complicated picture. Delucci, whose full name appears in some accounts as Antonio Delucci and in others simply by the surname, was connected to interests operating out of the Bronx and Lower Manhattan with ties to one of the established Italian-American crime families operating in New York during this period. He was not a boss. He was not a capo. But he was what the street called a serious man. Someone with protection, with a track record, and with the kind of operational authority that allowed him to move through New York's underworld with a degree of confidence that lower-level figures couldn't afford. He was in his early 40s in 1952. He had survived the brutal consolidation wars of the 1930s and 1940s. He had connections that reached into legitimate business, laundry operations, a piece of a trucking company, interest in 2 bars that were never quite legitimate, but were never quite rated either. He was, by the standards of his world, established. And here is where the situation gets psychologically interesting. Because Delucci's confidence, the specific kind of confidence that allowed him to sit across from Bumpy Johnson and say what he said, almost certainly came not from ignorance about who Johnson was, but from a particular structural assumption that was widespread in certain circles at the time. The assumption was this, that the Italian-American crime families, by virtue of their organizational structure, their national reach, and their established relationships with law enforcement and political figures, occupied a superior position in New York's underworld hierarchy. That black organized crime figures, however powerful locally, were ultimately subordinate players in a larger game controlled by others. That a man like Bumpy Johnson, for all his reputation in Harlem, operated at the sufferance of larger powers and could be reminded of that fact without consequence. This assumption was wrong. It was wrong factually. It was wrong strategically. And it was about to be demonstrated to be wrong in a way that Tony Delucci would spend the remainder of his career trying to navigate. The meeting itself was, by all accounts, a business meeting. The specific nature of the business has been described in various ways by different sources. Some suggest it concerned territory related to the narcotics trade, which was expanding rapidly in Harlem during this period and which Bumpy Johnson himself had complicated feelings about, as we'll discuss. Others suggest it concerned numbers territory or loan sharking operations along a specific corridor in Upper Manhattan. What the sources agree on is the setting. A private room, likely above a restaurant or social club, with somewhere between 8 and 12 men present. Some of these men were Johnsons. Some were Delucci's. Some appeared to have been present as neutral witnesses or brokers, the kind of senior figures whose presence was meant to ensure that any agreement reached would be honored. The meeting had been going for some time when Delucci made his remark. The exact words have been reported differently across different accounts. Some versions suggest it was a dismissive comment about Harlem as territory, implying it was worth less than Delucci's side had been led to believe. Some versions suggest it was more personal, a comment about Johnson's background, his time in prison, or his standing relative to the larger organizations at the table. One account, which comes from a source whose reliability is impossible to fully verify at this distance, suggests that Delucci made a comment about the literature, about the fact that Johnson was known to carry books, and that this was evidence of pretension rather than intelligence. Whatever the precise words, their effect was immediate and unmistakable. The men who were in that room knew what had just happened. The men on Johnson's side of the table went very still. The men who were present as neutral parties found reasons to look at the floor, or their hands, or the wall behind Johnson's head, because they understood something that Delucci, in that moment of tactical overconfidence, appeared to have momentarily forgotten. The most dangerous response to disrespect is silence. Not because silence means nothing is happening, but because silence means the decision has already been made, and the person who has been disrespected is simply choosing the time and method of the response with the same care and deliberateness they bring to everything else. Bumpy Johnson looked at Delucci for a long moment. Then he returned his attention to the business at hand. The meeting concluded. Hands are shaken or not shaken, depending on which account you believe. Men filed out into the cold Harlem night and went back to their respective worlds. And then the clock started. There is a concept in the study of organized crime that criminologists and historians sometimes refer to as soft power enforcement. It's the mechanism by which a powerful figure disciplines or punishes someone without using direct violence. A mechanism that, paradoxically, is often more effective than violence precisely because it's harder to document, harder to defend against, and far more psychologically destabilizing. Bumpy Johnson was a master of this. His approach to conflict, refined over 3 decades of operating in one of the most competitive and dangerous environments in America, was built on a principle he appears to have absorbed from both his reading and his experience: that the most durable power is the power that other people enforce on your behalf, not because you've ordered them to, but because it's in their interest to do so. What does that mean in practice? It means that Bumpy Johnson, in the days following the meeting with Delucci, did not need to issue orders to every person in his network. He did not need to convene a council, draft a plan, or make a single explicit threat. What he needed to do, and what the historical record suggests he did, was make 1 or 2 carefully placed communications to the right people, and then allow the network he had spent 30 years building to do what networks do when they understand that a slight to their central figure requires a response. The first thing that happened, and this is documented in enough separate accounts to treat as reliable, is that information began to dry up around Delucci's operation. In a world of organized crime in 1950s New York, information was currency. Knowing which blocks were hot, under police surveillance, was worth money. Knowing which judges were accessible, which court dates were vulnerable, which prosecutors were dealing and which were not, all of this traveled through informal networks that crossed ethnic and territorial lines because it was profitable for everyone involved. These information networks didn't run on charity. They ran on relationships, on reciprocity, on the understanding that the flow of useful intelligence benefited whoever maintained the connections. When those connections cooled quietly in the direction of Delucci's people, when the calls stopped being returned quite as promptly, when informal advisories that might have warned his men about a particular street stopped arriving, the effect was not immediately obvious. It was gradual, like a temperature drop. You notice after a while that something is different without being able to point to the exact moment it changed. The second thing that happened was more visible. Three of Delucci's street-level men, the runners and collectors who operated in the specific territory that had been the subject of the meeting, found that their usual arrangements were no longer functioning. Shops that had been accessible were suddenly unavailable. Men who had worked alongside them on specific operations quietly made themselves scarce. The social geography of several blocks in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx shifted in ways that made their daily operations functionally impossible without a level of effort and exposure that turned routine business into high-risk activity. This is the part of the story that requires careful attention because it reveals something important about how Bumpy Johnson's power actually worked. He did not control only his own men. He controlled, through years of relationship building, favors extended and collected, respect earned and strategically deployed, a far wider network of people who were not formally part of any organization, but who recognized his authority and responded to shifts in his disposition. Barbers who passed information, cab drivers who moved people and messages, clergymen who mediated disputes, bail bondsmen who could expedite or delay a release, lawyers who knew which calls to make, women who ran numbers, and who controlled access to specific apartment buildings. All of these people, none of them soldiers, none of them formally organized, constituted a kind of invisible infrastructure around which formal criminal organization was almost secondary. When Bumpy Johnson's displeasure became known in this network, not through announcements, but through the thousand subtle signals that move through close-knit communities, the network responded. Delucci's men weren't arrested. They weren't assaulted. They weren't threatened in any documented way. They were simply inconvenienced, persistently, in ways that accumulated, in ways that made it clear to anyone paying attention that the environment itself had turned against them. By the fourth day after the meeting, one of Delucci's most reliable collectors, a man who had worked a specific corridor in the upper 140s without incident for 3 years, simply wasn't there anymore. He had, according to people in the neighborhood, gone to visit family. This may have been true. It may also have been the most socially acceptable way of saying that he had recognized what was happening and decided that a voluntary retreat was preferable to the alternative. By the 6th day, a second man had made a similar calculation. By the end of the first week, Tony Delucci, sitting in a back room in the Bronx, receiving reports from men who were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the reports they were delivering, began to understand the dimensions of the problem he had created. He had not been attacked. No one could point to a specific act of aggression from Johnson's side. There was nothing to retaliate against, nothing to escalate, nothing to bring to the neutral parties who had witnessed the original meeting and say, "He did this, and we need to address it." That was the point. That was the message. If you've been paying attention, and I think you have been, you may have noticed that this story, at its core, is not really about crime. It's about respect, and about what happens when powerful men misread the nature of the power across the table from them. Tony Delucci's mistake was not tactical. His mistake was perceptual. He had built his understanding of the New York underworld around a hierarchy that placed certain organizations at the top and arranged everyone else beneath them in a clear structure. In that hierarchy, Bumpy Johnson, however feared in Harlem, however connected locally, occupied a position that could be defined, bounded, and therefore safely tested. What Delucci failed to account for was that Bumpy Johnson's power was not hierarchical. It was relational, and relational power has no ceiling you can see from the outside because it exists in the connections between people rather than in the formal structure above them. This is a distinction that the best historians of this period have tried to articulate, with varying degrees of success, because it requires abandoning the organizational charts and the crime family trees that make for clean academic analysis, and instead accepting a messier, more human picture. Bumpy Johnson knew, personally, individually, hundreds of people across New York City, not as employees, not as subordinates, as people he had helped, people who had helped him, people with whom he had shared a crisis or a meal or a moment of honesty in a world where honesty was rare and therefore valuable. Some of these people were in Harlem. Some were not. Some were black. Some were not. Some operated in the underground economy. Some were entirely legitimate. Journalists, academics, athletes, musicians, politicians who preferred that their relationship with Johnson remain informal but acknowledged it existed. This network was Bumpy Johnson's real power. Not his soldiers, not his territory, not his revenue. His relationships. And what Tony Delucci had done in that room on that night in early 1952 was not simply insult one man. He had, in the presence of witnesses, insulted a man whose relationships were the connective tissue of a significant portion of New York's underground economy. He had sent a signal, not intentionally, but unmistakably, that he did not understand what he was dealing with. That signal was received widely. Here is a detail that several sources mention, and that I find particularly revealing. In the days following the meeting, a number of people who were not connected to either Johnson or Delucci, who had no direct stake in their conflict, quietly adjusted their behavior in Delucci's direction. Not because they were ordered to, not because they feared Johnson directly, but because in the community's collective intelligence, the informal shared awareness of who was in whose favor and why, the calculation had shifted. And people who operate in uncertain environments are very good at calculating where to position themselves. Delucci's men weren't just being squeezed by Johnson's network. They were being abandoned by people who had no formal relationship with Johnson, but who had read the situation correctly and decided that proximity to Delucci's operation was no longer a safe investment of their social capital. This is the part of the story where I want to pause for just a moment. Because what you're witnessing here, in this account from 1952, in a Harlem back room and on the winter streets of Upper Manhattan, is actually a demonstration of a principle that operates far beyond organized crime. The principle that the most durable authority is not the authority that commands through force, but the authority that operates through understanding, through a comprehensive, detailed, constantly updated knowledge of the human landscape around it. Bumpy Johnson had spent 30 years building that knowledge, not as a strategic exercise, but as a way of surviving. Every connection he made, every favor he extended, every person he treated with respect when the structural incentives pushed toward treating them as instruments, all of it accumulated into something that no organizational chart could capture and no formal hierarchy could match. And now, in the winter of 1952, Tony Delucci was discovering what that network felt like from the outside. Before we get to what happened next, and what Delucci ultimately did, I want to say something directly. If you're watching this channel and you've been here for a while, you know that we don't tell these stories for spectacle. We tell them because the history of Harlem, the real history, the complicated history, the history of people who built entire worlds in the margins that formal society left them, deserves the same serious attention that we give to any other chapter of American life. If that's the kind of history that interests you, consider subscribing. We have a lot more coming. Now, back to Delucci. By the second week after the meeting, Tony Delucci had a problem that was becoming impossible to ignore or manage through his usual channels. The problem was not violence. The problem was erosion. The systematic, quiet, undeniable erosion of his operational capacity in the specific territory that the meeting had been about. And the more he looked at it, the more he had his people trace the edges of what was happening, the more he found that there was no single point of origin he could address, no individual act of aggression he could escalate against, no clear enemy position he could attack. There was only the spreading silence of a network that had turned its back on him. It was at this point that Delucci made the decision that, in retrospect, tells you everything about what the previous 2 weeks had accomplished. He made calls, not aggressive calls, not threatening calls, quiet calls through intermediaries to people who were known to have relationships with Bumpy Johnson, asking with as much dignity as could be maintained under the circumstances, whether a secondary conversation was possible, whether the matter that had been discussed could be revisited, whether certain things that had been said could be clarified or addressed. The language, as reconstructed from accounts of this period, was careful. It was the language of men who understand that they are asking for something without being able to explicitly acknowledge what they're asking for or why. Because to explicitly acknowledge it would be to formally concede a defeat, and formal concession in that world carried its own costs. The intermediaries, and here the accounts vary in their specifics, with some suggesting 2 or 3 separate individuals were involved and others describing a more direct channel, conveyed the inquiry. What came back was not a dramatic response. There was no triumphant declaration, no list of demands, no public humiliation engineered to match the public slight. What came back, according to the sources, was essentially nothing, a non-response, the equivalent, in diplomatic terms, of allowing someone to stand at a door without answering. Not to be cruel, but to make clear that the terms under which the door might open were entirely at the discretion of the person inside. This went on for several more days. And then, and this is the detail that makes the story complete, Bumpy Johnson resumed contact. Not through the intermediaries. Directly. Through a channel that was available to him and not easily available to Delucci, which itself communicated something about the asymmetry of the situation. The content of that communication has never been fully documented. What is known is that within a week of it, the operational situation on the relevant blocks had stabilized. Delucci's remaining men, those who had stayed rather than found reasons to visit family, were operating again, though in a somewhat reduced capacity and within boundaries that were somewhat more clearly defined than they had been before the original meeting. The territory question that had nominally been the subject of the meeting was resolved, according to the general consensus of accounts, in a way that was more favorable to Johnson's interests than the pre-meeting discussion had suggested it would be. And Tony Delucci, by all accounts, never again made a public comment about Bumpy Johnson or about Harlem that carried anything resembling contempt. There is one more detail that demands inclusion here, because it speaks to the particular quality of Johnson's character that made all of this possible. Throughout the entire 2.5-week sequence, from the original meeting to the final resolution, Bumpy Johnson had apparently gone about his daily life with essentially no visible change in his routine. He was seen at his usual haunts. He attended to his usual business. He was observed by people who watched him carefully and professionally, as being in apparently good spirits. He had not been anxious. He had not been angry, at least not visibly. He had simply been patient. The confidence required to be patient in that situation, to resist the temptation to escalate, to trust that the network he had built would function as designed, to allow time to do the work that force would have done less elegantly. That confidence was the product of 30 years of building something that most people never saw and never fully understood. It was also, in a sense, the product of those books he always carried, of a mind that had spent decades thinking about power, about history, about the way that durable authority is constructed and maintained. The poets and historians and philosophers he read in prison and on slow afternoons in Harlem had given him a framework for understanding his own situation that transcended the immediate tactical calculus of street life. He knew, in the deepest way a person can know something, that the most powerful demonstration of authority is the demonstration that requires no demonstration. Delucci had forced one anyway, and the lesson had been delivered without a single documented act of violence. Tony Delucci continued operating in the New York underworld for several more years after the events of 1952. His name appears in federal surveillance documents through the mid-1950s, though his operational footprint in certain areas appears to have contracted somewhat from its pre-1952 scope. By the late 1950s, the reorganization of Italian-American organized crime, following several significant federal prosecutions, had reshuffled the positions of figures at his level significantly, and his specific trajectory becomes difficult to trace with certainty. What is notable is the absence of any further documented friction between his interests and those of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson himself continued to be the central figure in Harlem's underground economy through the 1950s and into the 1960s, a period that brought its own profound challenges, including the expansion of the heroin trade into Harlem, which Johnson reportedly had complicated and evolving views about, and the beginning of the civil rights era's transformation of how Black Americans understood their relationship to both formal law and informal power. He was incarcerated again in the mid-1950s, as he had been before, and as would happen again. The federal government's attention to Harlem's underground economy never fully relented during his lifetime, and Johnson spent a significant portion of the 1950s navigating the legal system while simultaneously maintaining his standing in the street. But what the events of early 1952 established, what the Delucci episode cemented in the collective understanding of everyone who operated in that world, was something that went beyond a specific territorial question that had nominally been at stake. It established, with a precision that violence could not have achieved, the exact nature and the exact limits of Bumpy Johnson's power. The nature, relational, patient, comprehensive, and fully operational without the need for visible force. The limits, there were no limits that anyone in that ecosystem had been able to find. The legacy of this understanding extended well beyond the specific networks involved. In the oral history of Harlem, the stories that pass from person to person, from generation to generation, in barbershops and card games, and the quiet conversations that communities have with themselves about their own history, the Delucci story became a kind of parable. Not a parable about crime, exactly. A parable about the relationship between intelligence and power, about the specific kind of authority that is built through understanding rather than through force. The man who carries books, the story said, is not carrying them as decoration. There is another dimension to Bumpy Johnson's legacy that deserves acknowledgement here, because the full picture requires it. Johnson was not a saint. He was not a community hero in any uncomplicated sense. He operated a criminal enterprise that extracted money from people in one of America's most economically vulnerable communities. The numbers game, for all its role in funding informal community infrastructure, also took money from people who could not afford to lose it. The loan sharking operations, the protection arrangements, the political relationships that gave his operation cover, all of these had costs that were borne by ordinary Harlem residents in ways that are easy to obscure when telling a story like this one. Serious historians of this period, scholars like Michael Flam and newer researchers who have engaged with the oral history archives of Harlem's mid-century community, have grappled with this complexity. The portrait that emerges is of a figure who genuinely cared about the community he operated in, who extended real help to real people in moments of crisis, who commanded genuine affection and respect from many of the residents of the blocks he controlled, and who also ran a predatory enterprise whose structural logic was at odds with the long-term well-being of the very community he claimed to protect. This tension is not resolvable. It is simply true. What is also true is that Bumpy Johnson operated in a world where the formal economy and the formal legal system had made a specific set of choices about Black Americans, and he built something in the space those choices created. Whether that makes him a hero, a villain, or something more complicated than either category can contain. That's a question each person watching this needs to sit with themselves. What the Delucci episode tells us, at minimum, is that he was a man of exceptional intelligence, exceptional patience, and an almost architectural understanding of how power works when it's built from relationships rather than from rules. He died on July 7th, 1968, at a table in his favorite Harlem restaurant, Wells Chicken and Waffles on 132nd Street, surrounded by friends. He was 62 years old. The New York Times covered his death. Hundreds of Harlem residents turned out for his funeral. People who had known him for decades, and people who had simply known of him, came to pay their respects to a man who had, over the course of 40 years, become as much a part of the neighborhood as the buildings themselves. Mamie Johnson, his wife, would later write a memoir that offered a rare, intimate portrait of the man behind the legend. A man who loved literature, who worried about the community's children, who had moments of profound doubt about the life he'd chosen, and who never stopped carrying books. The books were still there at the end. There's a final thought I want to leave you with. In 1952, a man sat across a table from Ellsworth Raymond Johnson and decided, for whatever reasons, tactical or personal, or simply human, that he could afford to show contempt, that the hierarchy, as he understood it, permitted him to do this without consequence. He was wrong. But what makes the story worth telling? What makes it worth more than a cautionary tale about misjudging dangerous people is the specific nature of how he was wrong. He was wrong not because Bumpy Johnson was more violent than him, or more organizationally powerful, or better connected to the formal levers of authority. He was wrong because Bumpy Johnson had spent 30 years building something that doesn't appear on any organizational chart, doesn't show up in any financial record, and can't be seized in a federal raid. He had built trust, carefully, deliberately, and at great personal cost, across lines of race and class and formal affiliation, with hundreds of individual people who each had their own reasons to either support him or not. He had built a network of relationships so dense and so well-maintained that when one person in it was threatened, when the architecture of his dignity was challenged, the network responded. Not because it was ordered to, because it understood what was at stake. That is a kind of power that no one can simply acquire. It has to be built day by day, over years and decades, through choices that often cost something in the short term and pay out only much later. Tony Delucci found that out in the winter of 1952. The streets of Harlem have been remembering it ever since.